Gas prices have been pretty stable the past few months, but right now we're seeing two things. First off, a brand new administration, and what impact will that have on everything going forward? And secondly, we're about to enter the spring transition of summer blend fuel. We're going to talk about what that means to your business and possibly to consumers. Joining us today for our conversation is Denton Cinquegrana. He is Chief Oil Analyst at OPIS and a regular guest on our show, and of course, an expert on fuels. So thanks for joining us today, Denton.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So before we look at where we are in terms of big trends, let's take a step back. And what took place in 2024 that might inform how 2025 plays out in both the oil and the fuels markets overall?
Well, I do think one of the things that kind of happened in 2024 versus previous years, you have 2020 COVID, 2021 coming out of COVID, 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2023 and 2024 were kind of those, use the term loosely, but normal years where the market peaks late first quarter, sometime in the second quarter, comes down. Then you have that secondary peak in the summertime, and then spends the rest of the, kind of mid third quarter and fourth quarter dropping. 2024 was kind of one of those normal years. Geopolitical tensions, of course, at the forefront. Obviously, things have kind of simmered a little bit in the Middle East and cooled off a little bit, but now we're turning attention to Russia and Ukraine towards the end of the year. So that's probably not going away despite the new administration coming in, or at least not going away right away. So that's one of the things to keep an eye on. I think President Biden, or former President Biden now, gave a final parting gift to Trump in the form of more sanctions on Russia, sanctioning the quote unquote shadow fleet, the ships that are moving that call it illegal Russian oil. Those sanctions have a little bit more teeth. So now maybe he painted Trump into a little bit of a corner here as the new year gets started and the new administration gets started, with Trump saying, hey, I'm going to drop gas prices by 50% or drop energy prices in general by 50%. You would assume he's meaning gasoline prices in there as well. He's already talked about, cheaper gasoline prices during his administration. But you have that on one side, but with the sanctions, that's going to be a little bit more difficult to do. And then if he loosens the sanctions on the Russian shadow fleet, then he looks more, for lack of a better terms, sort of Putin's puppet. So, he's painted into a corner kind of right away here. So it'll be interesting to see how that, kind of takes shape. But, the way these sanctions will have more bite is Russia's two key customers during this kind of sanctions period have been India and China. Now they're going to have to look for alternative sources. And
that's only, one half of the world's population?
Yeah, exactly. So just a few people in those two countries.
Yeah, and going back to what you were talking about with President Trump saying that he can cut gas prices in half. We're both in this business, and we know that if gas prices were to get cut in half, something more likely than not bad happened than good happened, because dramatically lower prices are related to dramatically lower demand, and that usually means some sort of economic distress. It is very, very difficult to drop prices significantly in a positive economic situation.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there, Jeff. And again, if we do see gasoline prices in half of what they are now, and a little over $3 a gallon as the new year got started, up in the $3.10, $3.15 area at inauguration, slightly higher than they were at this time last year, but not tremendously higher. If you see prices at half of what they are, that means something bad went really, really wrong. Something went really, really wrong in the economy. And there is some potential for some policies that could lead that way. I don't think they'll be that drastic, but there's some issues kind of underlying out there. But kind of that being said, we're kind of hopeful that things become, one of those more normal years that you can kind of bank on it, where, we believe this year it's going to be front loaded as far as oil is concerned. You do have the sanctions that we talked about briefly earlier, but also OPEC has said that they're going to start to return some production come April. Now, can they continue to expand that out? Sure. But I think you have countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates who are really kind of chomping at the bit to bring some of that production back online. OPEC has, and OPEC Plus has about 5 million barrels a day of spare capacity sitting on the sidelines. At the same time, they're watching countries like the United States and Canada and Brazil and Guyana, all their production going up, and in the case of the United States and Canada, to record levels. How long do you sit by and, to use a phrase, how long do you sit by and let countries like the United States and Canada steal your lunch money?
Mm-hmm. So, I think this is an obvious question, but it's worth asking. OPEC holds to some level of production limits. As a whole, it worked very well in the early 70s and even in the late 70s when they could exert their market pressure to move prices. There's a lot of cheating that goes on with these right now. It's like, yeah, I'm doing this, but I'm really doing that. And really, the only reason is if you can sell more oil, you can make more money. So is there any other reason that somebody would want to increase production? Is it because the idea of market power may not exist anymore? So why try to pretend it does and make a little money?
Well, to kind of correct you on one little point there is that they've actually been incredibly disciplined over the past, year and a half, 2 years since they've kind of put this set of production cuts in place. They have caught some cheaters, but those cheaters have said, "Hey, look, we did go over this month. We're going to go below what our quota was." So they've been really, really good at managing that whole thing. But yes, to your point, prices go higher. $80, $90, $100 a barrel. Yeah, I'm going to try and sneak a few extra barrels in there. Mm-hmm. I'll pay, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, right? So I think that's one of the things that has happened over the past couple of years is they've been pretty disciplined. But at the same time, you don't want to lose too much market share. And that's what was happening back in 2014 with the shale revolution, when the United States started to see production ramp up and become a bigger player on the world stage as far as oil production was concerned. Now, granted, there were export restrictions in place, but that got lifted during the Obama administration. And that's when the United States became kind of this, became a real player as far as exporting oil is concerned. But in 2014, OPEC and countries within said, "Hey, you shale guys, we're going to show you what's what. We're going to put you out of business. We're going to open up the taps, produce as much as we want, ship it out as much as we want. We're going to show you we're still the big boys on the block here." And it never happened. Obviously prices collapsed. The shale producers adapted and changed, and those break-even costs have gone from $70, $80, $90 a barrel in places like West Texas, kind of southeast New Mexico, et cetera. Those break-even prices are now in the $40, $50 area, and in some places, the best in class could do it for around $20 a barrel. So there is some profit at when the oil price is $70, $75 a barrel, like it is now, and you're pulling it out of the ground for $45, $50. You're still doing all right. Now, granted, some of these OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, namely, they're the most cost advantaged, and they're just they're perhaps playing the long game, but they're waiting also for the market to become a little bit more balanced. I think it is balanced right now and has been for much of the past several months, which is why we didn't see prices spike or they didn't collapse either. We've had relatively tight balances, or supply and demand pretty much matching one another. I think part of that is because China had their issues in late 2024 with their economy. Obviously one of the big customers of OPEC producers. And, with them kind of struggling economically, OPEC said, hey, we could continue to keep this production on the sidelines. Prices would react by moving up a little bit with these OPEC announcements, but it wouldn't be long lasting enough where it says, hey, let's try and sneak a little bit more in there.
And going back to what you're talking about with the shale revolution under the second term of President Obama, that's the only time this century when prices collapsed, and it wasn't because of some sort of economic calamity. That was just a dramatic oversupply or a push against supply. So the only time that's really happened where prices significantly went down, the other without like something bad economic. We jumped right in and we started talking about politics. We started talking about the new administration. We started talking about those types of things. But we're talking basically right after the inauguration. There's been 24 hours for you to process this flurry of activity, these executive actions that may or may not impact the industry. There are things related to EVs and drilling and things like that. And not to ask you how this will play out, but what is the timeline in how these could play out, and what might be an action if they do play out?
Yeah, we'll start with drilling. Obviously, drill, baby drill, which is a phrase that's been used over and over again, not just by Trump, but others as well. But again, we are drilling, baby drilling. Mm-hmm. We're at record levels of production. Now, one of the things the administration is planning on doing is obviously opening more lands for drilling, probably making the permitting process a little bit easier. And, we say how the president can't control the price of oil or the price of, what they can do is, I guess, make it a little bit easier. Mm-hmm. to get to oil and produce and drill, et cetera. But at the end of the day, economics and supply and demand do matter. So, yeah, it might be easier to, put up a new rig. And again, doing something in deepwater Gulf of Mexico, that takes years. So, you do that, start that permitting process today, let's say February 1st, mm-hmm. you may not see any oil come to market until the early 2030s. So something to keep in mind there. Sure, you make it easier, but some of that oil is not going to come to play right away. Now, with West Texas and fracking, on land, that's a little bit closer to 7 months. That's where you see your more near-term impacts. Will it happen? Hard to say. We're producing a lot of oil as it currently stands. Can we go up a couple 100,000 barrels a day? Sure, in 2025. The 2 to 3 million barrels that's being kind of thrown around lately, I think that's a little bit tough and a little bit too much to ask for. Is it possible? Sure, but I don't necessarily think that's going to happen.
Combined barrels for energy, are we at about 16 million barrels per day, and about 11 is oil? Is that about right?
Yeah, 13. It's about 13 oil, a little bit over 13. But that number about 16 combined is probably about right. And then the other one that has really gotten a lot of folks' attention in these markets is tariffs. Obviously, blanket tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Mexico is the United States' number one trade partner. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to energy, it's Canada by a mile. We import more than 50% of our imports of crude oil come from Canada. It's that heavy sour crude that refiners in the United States have spent billions of dollars over the last 25 years to put in the equipment at refineries to take what is really a cheaper, crappier, if you want to use my language, crude oil, and turn it into useful products. Now, if you add 25% to the price of Western Canadian Select, which is the heavy Canadian crude oil, well, that's going to pose a problem for refiners in the Chicago area and the Great Lakes, as well as some refineries on the Gulf Coast as well. We tend to talk about the crude oil aspect, but there's parts of the country, particularly the Northeast, that get refined products from Canada. You think of New England, they get a lot of products, refined products, whether it's gasoline, diesel, heating oil from the Irving refinery in St. John's in the Canadian Maritimes. But, one kind of little forgotten about area is Northwest New York, the Buffalo area. Mm-hmm. They import a lot of finished gasoline from right across the lake in Canada. And if that's going to be subject to a 25% tariff, you could certainly expect to see gasoline prices go up in that part of the country.
And if I recall, our imports from Canada are roughly 4 million barrels a day, right around that number.
Yeah, depending on the week, and that's just on the crude oil side. Interestingly enough, right before the end of the year in the weekly Energy Information Administration data, the preliminary imports from Canada were at an all-time high. It was like 4.325 million barrels a day, somewhere in that neighborhood. But it was by far and away the most that Canada had ever exported to the United States. And my theory, and I think a lot of people would also come to this conclusion, is that you're trying to cram as much into the United States before some of these tariffs go into effect. And the next few EIA reports, I would suspect that'll show up a few more times. I don't know if that, the phrase records are made to be broken, and I feel like that record might be made to be broken within the next few weeks.
And so when you talk about 4 million barrels per day coming from Canada out of roughly 20 million U.S. demand, you're looking at about 20% of U.S. supply. So obviously it could have a big hit. So this is more of an energy nerd kind of question, but I think it does play out in at a corner store that's selling fuel. So when you talk about these refineries that are optimized to accept a certain type of fuel, some are sweet, some are sour, that means either light or heavy, and the refining process is set up for that type. So in Venezuela, I believe, was also heavy, and Canada probably largely replaced that for those refineries. What would a refinery do if Canadian oil prices go up 25% because of tariffs? Would they just be at a competitive disadvantage, or would they start to optimize their processes to go accept another type of fuel? How long would that take? And then what happens if they have to switch back? So there are a lot of questions here. So just pick the ones you like to answer.
And I think from a refiner standpoint, look, Canada isn't the only one who makes a heavy sour crude. You mentioned Venezuela; they're going to probably be off the table based on some of the comments Trump made, early in office. So let's forget about Venezuela for now. But Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, these are countries that still make pretty heavy sour crude. Mexico as well, but they're going to be subject to tariffs as well. So you're going to look for alternatives. Obviously, that's kind of your first avenue, if you will. So the other one is you could potentially see run cuts. I don't think that necessarily happens, but if we can't get the heavy crude that we are looking for, we may have to trim back a little bit. Mm-hmm. The United States is the United States oil that's produced is a very light, very sweet, and refiners here are kind of maxed out on how much of that they can run. So that's why you do see exports of crude oil from the United States in the magnitude of anywhere from 3 to 5 million barrels a day, depending on the week and month. But it's a light sweet crude oil that works well with the call them less sophisticated refineries. Mm-hmm. We're a little the refineries in the United States are very complex. They could take crude oil that's like a hockey puck, just a big ball of garbage and turn it into gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. You do get a lot of asphalt, which again is kind of the downside. But suffice it to say, you're making lemons out of lemonade in a lot of cases. You would have to find some alternative supplies unless Canada, the Canadian market drops to the point where producers are selling it at a 25% discount above what it's selling at now.
Well done for comparing the heavier Canadian oil to a hockey puck.
Yeah.
So points there. Um, we covered politics. We covered global conditions because they all interweave. Want to end with just talking about consumers. We do a lot of consumer surveys. We have the results of one coming out in the February issue of Next magazine, looking at um, what's people's moods and what are they saying they're going to do in stores. The good news is they told us that they're in a better mood than they were each of the last 2 years. They're up about 10 points over 2 years ago, and I think it goes back to what you started out this episode talking about, Denton. It's that we're 1 year further away from COVID, and yes, there's always all kinds of things that can weigh on your mind, whether it's personally or some other way. But people are feeling a little better because that's a little further away and it feels a little bit more normal. Are there any things that, when you look at the markets at the gas pump instead of at the oil rig, that you might see that will happen differently, or we need to look out for this year? You had mentioned that the traditional is that spring transition. There's a run up, typically average about 52 points if it's a typical year because of all the transition and the complexity. And then after September 1st, it goes back to winter blend fuel and moderates a bit. But anything that could be different this year?
Yeah, they could always be different. And again, I think, let's start it out by saying the economy appears to be in, good shape. Unemployment's low. People are working. People can get jobs, etc. One of the things I do think that maybe will have more and more of an impact as we go down the line this year is more people are returning to the office. A lot of hybrid work is still out there, but starting to see a few more announcements. A couple of the big banks on Wall Street now, being close to New York. No one drives into New York to go to the office, and especially now with congestion pricing throughout much of Manhattan, no one drives. But you have to drive. If you're here in New Jersey, you drive to the train station, you drive to the ferry terminal, et cetera, to get to New York. So if you're doing that 5 days a week, that's a lot different than one or two or none. So that, I think, gasoline demand in 2025 is probably going to be kind of flat to maybe even a little bit of a notch higher. I don't think it goes gangbusters or anything like that, but flat to a notch higher. Gasoline prices in 2024 did come down, averaged about $3.33 according to our data. That's down about almost 20 cents from 2023. And I do think that trend does continue, even though people are going back to the office, generally speaking, and there's going to be probably a little bit more demand. But at the same time, cars continue to get a little bit more efficient. I've always been talking about, does EVs have an impact? As it currently stands, it's still pretty small, but expect that to go up over time. But now is probably not that time. Mm-hmm. The other thing to kind of keep an eye out for this year is the Lyondell refinery in Houston is shutting down. Phillips 66 is shutting a refinery in California, in Southern California. So that's two right there. There's another refinery in Scotland, the Grangemouth refinery, that's being closed. So that's three in the OECD countries. There's two refineries that have been kind of talked about for the last couple of years. The one being the Dangote refinery in Nigeria. This one is getting closer and closer to being able to produce on-spec gasoline in the United States, for U.S. spec gasoline. I think their exports of gasoline will start to ramp up probably sometime in the second quarter. I wouldn't expect a kind of full push to the U.S., but it could make some noise this year in the U.S. and Europe. And then the Dos Bocas refinery in Mexico, who knows when that's going to be at anything close to nameplate capacity of about 340,000 barrels a day. I wouldn't hold my breath on that one, but I think Dangote has the potential to be a real game changer. And, I wouldn't be surprised, whether it's in Europe or the United States, to see one of these, kind of disadvantaged refineries, kind of throw in the towel. Mm-hmm. I think there's a possibility of that. Now, whether that is, where that happens, not sure. I mean, California is always a possibility, considering one, I talk about how EVs don't necessarily make an impact. Well, from a national perspective, they really don't, but in California, they do.
Yeah.
Also, the industry's, let's call it, less than warm relationship with the governor of California. Mm-hmm. So that's one place to keep an eye on, where there's a possibility of a refinery shutdown. And, let's keep in mind, some of these refineries are over 100 years old. Obviously, improvements, right, additions, et cetera, have been made over the course of that century. But at the end of the day, some of these are pretty old and, maybe up for, kind of mothballing. So that's one thing I would definitely keep an eye on. Would it have an impact on gasoline prices? I don't know if it's necessarily a significant impact, at least in 2025, 2026 and beyond. Then maybe we have another story there.
Now, California, first off, refineries, about 40 years ago, there were 300 or so. Now there's about 140 that are operating in the U.S., so they've been cut in half. Production's doubled, more than doubled to meet demand. But when you have half the refineries, when one goes offline, the impact is not twice as big, but a factor beyond that. So particularly in California, you have the West Coast that is separated by mountains, and it's almost a different country in terms of refining and how things move about. So something to think about there. And
yeah, for sure.
It's that unanticipated refinery incident that could send the markets in a pretty wacky direction.
Yeah, and for a while, for a pretty long time, California has been kind of walking that tightrope as it pertains to refineries. So they've always gotten by, but the last couple of years, 22 and 23 in particular, you had obviously what was going on in the world, but also one of the things that isn't necessarily the same issue that it was back then was droughts in the Panama Canal. You couldn't say, hey, refinery on the Gulf Coast, refinery A, we need some gasoline on the West Coast at refinery B. Well, the Panama Canal's backed up. Instead of the 9 to 14 days it would take to go from the Gulf Coast to California, well, now that's the better part of a month, and resupply becomes a lot more challenging. With the Panama Canal, kind of running back to normal, you can kind of move stuff from point A to point B. But yeah, California is always one that you keep an eye on, and the Pacific Northwest as well.
So wrapping up, one final question. A lot of folks in our industry have been talking about the TV show Landman. What's your take on it? Have you seen it? Have you had any feedback from folks that say, "Oh, I finally understand all your lingo"? What's your feedback on it?
Well, I haven't watched it yet. I just finished watching Tulsa King, so that's the Landman's next on the list.
Same writer.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I guess he did the Yellowstones as well. Yep. So he's found a niche for himself. But yeah, I'm gonna look to watch that very soon. No one has really said to me yet, "Oh, I could speak your language now." But that being said, it seems like people have become a little bit more, I don't know if it's attuned, I don't know if that's the right word for it, but like a little, it's created a little bit of more understanding of maybe a little bit about how these markets work. We'll have to do a follow-up review podcast after I watch it to kind of go through some of the finer points.
Yeah, and when you talk about better understanding in the industry, of course, that's from OPIS, that's from all the different associations and members that have spent the better part of 20 years explaining the system and explaining what goes into the price of gas and what goes into making sure your fill up is consistent. There's 40 million fill ups a day and all these other things. So taking the mystery out, I think, has gotten us less blowback. And, like I said, thanks to OPIS and a whole bunch of other folks. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say 3 months from now, you have a chance to 2 months from now, you'll have a chance to hear more from Denton. He's going to be one of the speakers at the next State of the Industry Summit, which will be in Dallas this year on April 8 to 10. And you'll be that much further away from the new administration just starting, and maybe a little bit more into insights as we go through that spring transition to summer blend fuel and all the other big things that are happening in the world. So thank you again for joining us, Denton, and we look forward to seeing you on stage in April.
Thanks, Jeff. Looking forward to it myself. Yes, thank you.
And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.